Members of Council, if I can please have you take your seats. Members, can you please take your seats? Can we please rise for the national anthem? Please remain standing for a moment of silence and personal reflection. Thank you. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. For the benefit of those who are connected to the internet, the City Clerk has posted all of the agenda materials for today's meeting at toronto.ca/council. This special meeting of Council is scheduled for the following purposes: to consider the Executive Committee report from its meeting on March 4th, to introduce and enact general bills, and to introduce and enact a confirming bill for this special meeting. Members of Council, this is a special meeting, and under Council's procedures, no new business items such as notices of motions may be introduced. This rule cannot be waived. Our next regular meeting is scheduled to begin on March 27th. Members may submit notices of motions to that meeting. I will now call upon the Mayor to introduce the Executive Committee report. Mayor Tory, you have a motion to introduce the Executive Committee report?
I do. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move that the report from Meeting 2 of the Executive Committee listed on the agenda of Council be presented for consideration. And I want to begin, as I've done a number of times, but I think it bears repeating, to thank, in particular, the City staff. The City staff, as you know, operate in particularly challenging circumstances in an election year with respect to the preparation of the budget. Perhaps to their relief, they don't have the availability of us as elected representatives to assist them. I'll use that in quotation marks. And, of course, the period then after the election is truncated with respect to the approval and consideration of the budget. And I think they've, as always, worked terribly hard. And we have a new Chief Financial Officer and a new City Manager, and I think they both got themselves up to speed on what is, I think we'd all acknowledge, an incredibly complex undertaking that we have put in front of them and done their very best to now put us in a position where we can deliberate on this budget today. The task itself, Madam Speaker, is the same as it is every year. And I think regardless of sort of where we come from in terms of our perspective on the budget, I think we all acknowledge that somewhere, and the challenge in this chamber and with the public is to find a balance. I think we'd all agree there is one to be found, and people will have different opinions on how well we do or sort of which way the balance goes, but the balance between making sure the city remains affordable and that we manage the city's finances responsibly, as we've been credited with doing by our rating agencies who look at these things objectively, on the one hand, and on the other hand, investing in city services to make sure the city goes forward and continues to improve as a place to live. I think that the people of Toronto understand this balanced approach, and I think the vast majority of them, Madam Speaker, and I think this budget that we'll debate today, I think the vast majority of them understand that the answer lies neither in cutting of services, nor does it lie in dramatic increases in taxation that people just can't cope with at this point in time. And that is at the essence of what we will talk about today. But I think that the city staff, and now complemented, if I can put it that way, by the efforts of the Budget Committee and by the input received from the public, have done a good job to make sure, as I said earlier this morning, that the people of Toronto are faced neither with sticker shock from an increase in their cost of living in this city imposed by the government that they can't deal with, nor are they faced with service shock. In fact, there is no service shock because this budget does maintain every single city service without a cut, and invests in some of those city services like transit, community safety, libraries, and Toronto community housing. And I think that is, if the people were given the chance to write the budget themselves, I think the vast majority of them, knowing that even as I go out, as we all do, around the city, you're never going to find unanimity on what you should be doing. That's the challenging part of our jobs, but I think the vast majority of them would form a consensus around this kind of balanced, responsible budget. And so, and I'm guided by what they say. I know it aggravates often sometimes fellow councillors, and it certainly sometimes aggravates some members of the media when I talk about the real life encounters that I have with citizens of Toronto, as we all do. And I think that is the message that they give me. Yes, please keep investing as well as you can in the services that are the most important to us, including transit, housing, libraries, and the like, and helping people who are struggling. But at the same time, please be mindful of the fact that we are ourselves finding it challenging to live in a growing and very successful city, but one which is expensive to live in. And so I look forward to today. I've now been through enough of these that I know the nature of this day, which can be confusing to people watching, in that they will see a budget being presented and they would think it should be a simple matter of saying yes or no, but it isn't that simple, and that's fine. Bless the fact that we have a chance here to discuss different ideas that people have, as they have been discussed in the weeks leading up to the budget. But the only thing I would say in conclusion is this is the culmination of weeks of consideration. Weeks of listening to people, weeks of our staff, months of our staff considering what we should do and what we can do within the context of the resources that are available, and that we have arrived at this point with what I believe is a balanced, responsible document that neither imposes sticker shock nor does it impose service shock on people. And I think in this challenging year, when we had an $80 million shortfall on land transfer tax, we all know that, that is quite an achievement, to be able to present a budget that doesn't cut services and give service shock, nor does it dramatically increase taxes and give sticker shock to people. And I in particular want to, just as I conclude, commend the budget chief. This is as we all know, all the jobs you take on around here beyond just being elected and serving your constituents are an extra challenge that we're given as part of the job. That one that the budget chief takes on is a particularly onerous one, and it's even more onerous in election year. And I think working together with our staff, who I believe have done an excellent job, I commend them for that. And let's get on with what I hope will be a constructive debate. And I hope it's constructive in the context that people are looking at all the places where government is going on in Canada and outside right now, and they're seeing a lot of things they don't like. And I just hope we can, in this new council, set an example of how we can have a discussion, we can have differences of opinion, we can have differences of perspective, we will take votes, but that we can maintain a civilized consideration of this very important, most important document over the course of the day. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. All those in favor of the motion, recorded vote.
The motion carries unanimously, 23 in favor.
Thank you. Meeting adjourned. That's the fastest budget. Before I call for declarations of interest, I wish to remind members of council that changes to the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act took effect on March 1st. In addition to making a verbal declaration of interest at meetings, members are now also required to file a written declaration of interest with the city clerk. And the city is required to make a registry of these declared interests available for public inspection. The city clerk has posted the registry of declared interests online at www.toronto.ca/council. The city clerk has provided members' offices with blank forms, and I would encourage members to come to meetings with their forms completed and ready to hand to the clerk. If you need a blank form, the city clerk staff have copies available. Are there any declarations of interest? Councillor Layton.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. On item EX 20, on EX 4.2.2, I believe it is, the water budget. I need to declare an interest on the portion of the water budget as it pertains to the Blue Flag program, as my partner works for the organization that's paid a small fee-for-service grant to administer the program.
Thank you. Mayor Tory.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I have 4 here that all relate to the same, they relate to different items but the same interest. Because of my involvement with the Rogers Family Trust, as previously disclosed many times, Rogers Communications provides telephone and cellular services, wireless devices, internet and Wi-Fi services to the City of Toronto. And so across the items 2.2, the wastewater budget, 2.3, the solid waste management services and solid waste rates budget, 2.4, the rate-supported budgets for the parking authority, and 2.5, the capital and operating budgets. I will declare an interest in that regard, and as well, there's a smaller item in the latter 2.5 that relates to news summary services that are provided by Canada Newswire, in addition to the previously mentioned services provided by Rogers Communications, and I have the appropriate forms here.
Thank you. Councillor Pasternak.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. In an abundance of caution, I'd like to declare an interest in items operating and capital 2.5 related to Toronto Public Library, as my spouse, although it left the library and is on leave, technically is still an employee there.
Thank you. Are there any petitions at this time? We will now review and confirm the order paper. Once the order paper has been approved by council, any change will need a 2/3 vote. The mayor has identified item EX 2.1 on the 2019 property tax rates and related matters as his first key item. Item EX 2.5 on the 2019 capital and operating budgets as the mayor's second key matter. These will be our first items of business today. We are scheduled to meet until 6 p.m. tonight. We will take a scheduled recess between 12:30 and 2 p.m. Council will reconvene tomorrow at 9:30 if necessary. The city manager and the chief financial officer and treasurer are prepared to give a presentation on the 2019 budget. Members will have an opportunity to ask questions on each of the executive committee items when the items come up for debate. There will be no separate round of questions on the staff presentation. Members, we have 6 items before us. Items 1 to 5 will be debated, but does anyone wish to hold item 6? No? Okay, all those in favor? Councillor Perks?
On a point of order, Speaker, I would like to ask the Mayor to consider item EX 2.1 and 2.5, the property tax rates and the actual expenditures together as a single item.
No, Madam Speaker, I think we'll stick with those as 2 separate items and consider them as we've done previously.
Thank you. All those in favor of adopting the order paper and item 6, recorded vote.
Councillor Wong-Tam, please.
The order paper is adopted. The vote is 20 to 3.
Thank you. Members, I am expecting there will be a number of motions today, and to ensure that members in the public understand the motions that are placed, members are reminded to work with the clerk staff to prepare your motions. This will enable the clerk staff to display them. Members are also reminded to state their motions before they speak. So before we go to the presentation of the budget, Councillor Mallow, you wanted to make a brief announcement.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Mr. Mayor, members, before you, you will see the recently published Toronto Senior Strategy 2.0. You may remember several years ago, we as a council initiated the first Toronto Senior Strategy, which is a proactive strategy to address the reality that our society and our city is rapidly changing and aging. By 2041, roughly 20% of us are going to be seniors, and seniors have challenges, whether it be regarding health, transportation, housing, and so many other priorities that we want to focus on through a well-thought-out strategy. I want to recognize Andrea Austin, who has been our team leader, a staff leader on the strategy, who's done such remarkable work. She has led consultations, often with members of council, throughout our city in every ward to arrive at this point. And also my co-chair, Dr. Samir Sinha, who has provided not only great leadership at the city, but has personified a bridge with the provincial senior strategy to make sure that not only are we not in conflict, but that we are working in concert and actually quite amicably with each other to achieve our common goals for our seniors here in Toronto and across Ontario. You'll see through here that there are a number of recommendations that I believe, will all want to work through to see through to fruition. And I really just wanted to bring it to your attention. We don't always read everything before us, but I encourage you to read it. Pardon me? Look at the pictures, however you're able to digest it. But it really is an incredibly important read. I'll just conclude by saying that I believe that if we build a truly seniors-friendly city, we build an age-friendly Toronto. Whether you are a young parent or somebody middle-aged with mobility challenges, or somebody in your 80s, if we build a respectful, caring, accessible city for all, we all benefit, and that's work that we can begin today. So thank you very much, everyone, and I look forward to hearing your feedback as you read the report. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now ask the city manager for the budget presentation. Oh, sorry. Before we get to that, Councillor Wong-Tam was not here for the petitions, and she has petitions she would like to present.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. This petition is coming from the Neighborhood Information Post, an organization that's located in Moss Park in the downtown east, and I would like to present this petition to members of council. It reads, Dear Mayor Tory and Councillor Wong-Tam, as your constituents, we are asking City Council to invest in more community resources in Toronto Downtown East, particularly in homelessness prevention programs and services. Homelessness is a crisis in Toronto, and we have a record number of people using the shelter system. The lack of affordable social housing units, rapidly rising rent, and low vacancy rate have led to a high number of our community members being homeless or precariously housed. It is vital for Council to increase funding to divert vulnerable individuals and families from shelters into housing, to keep vulnerable individuals and families in stable housing and avert eviction, and 3, to increase available shelter space. With the overflowing shelter system, it is urgent for the City of Toronto to take immediate actions to prevent homelessness and housing crisis. We urge City Council to put in additional funding resources for the homelessness prevention programs and shelters, such as the rent bank, the Tenant Defense Fund, as well as the trustee program in the 2019 budget. Sincerely signed, 120 people. And Madam Speaker, I'd also like to just take a moment on a point of personal privilege to acknowledge the community members of Access to Recreation. They are a Regent Park local community group that has been advocating for equitable, fair access to recreation services in the city. They're behind me right now wearing white t-shirts with the name of the group on that. 2 nights ago, parents slept outside, literally they slept outside of community centers in -21 degrees Celsius weather. It demonstrates the ability and the passion of parents to go that extra distance to protecting their children. I just want to say thank you to them for joining us today. Thank you.
All in favor of approving the petitions? On favor? Carried. Okay. City Manager.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, Mayor Tory, members of council, and I just want to echo the mayor's comments about the men and women of the Toronto Public Service that are here today that contributed significantly to this budget, so I'm very proud to do this. This presentation you have seen, or many of you have seen a couple of times now, so we're going to try and abbreviate it a bit, get to the point. As before, I'll provide a very high-level overview, followed by Heather Taylor, our CFO, who will speak to the operating and rate aspect of it, and then, of course, Josie Levita, who will speak to the capital program. So without further ado, if I can, just go to my next slide. Are we good? All right. So as I've done on the first two presentations, I think it's always important to put in context our relationship with the citizens of this great community, your responsibilities as elected members of this council and your leadership role, and then, of course, the public service. And so as Torontonians, each and every day, they do make a point of communicating their aspirations to you. And with those aspirations, you promise back to them leadership, and together you create a vision for the City of Toronto. And of course, between City Council and the public service, there is direction that you give us, and of course, we manage that direction, and together we create a strategy for delivery of services each and every day. And then, of course, between the public service and our citizens, they provide us money in the form of taxes and rates and fees. And of course, we in response provide them services. In this case, we provide over 150 services. And they expect for their money, of course, value. So that's in essence the relationship. And of course, what's at the center of all this is the way that the public service is expected to do its work. It's to each and every day earn people's trust and confidence. Next slide. As the mayor pointed out, we did not have a specific direction provided to us because you were busy campaigning and finding yourself back here. So we did reflect on the last term of council, some of the priorities that we saw and some of the direction that occurred through the budget process. And so just to highlight very quickly for you, obviously housing has been a key consideration of this council, as well as mobility. By that we mean transit, cycling, walking. People in neighborhoods, the issues that we have in our community, and I'm going to speak to that in a moment. Modernization, every government across this globe is looking at better ways of delivering services, and of course some of that is done through technology. And of course all of us are wrestling with the challenge of sustaining our services in healthy, financially healthy manners. So, and so with that, we did take the last term of council's budget direction, not just in terms of priorities, but the kinds of increases that we've seen over the last 4 years, and that has helped guide it, the balanced budget that we're providing you today. Next slide. And it goes without saying, and in fact, some of you just this morning have echoed some of the things that are true about this community, that certainly from a social equity standpoint, all of you know that the middle class is shrinking, and that we're seeing more and more people fall into poverty. And as we age as a community, we know as well that people don't all have pensions and have the kinds of benefits that many of us in this room are able to enjoy. And so all of this is becoming a challenge. So is the job market. Many of the people that are coming up, entering the job market, don't find as many permanent jobs and find that a lot of the opportunities that present them are precarious. And so this is all creating a dynamic that I think is concerning, to say the least, and is going to continue certainly for some time. I don't have to tell anyone in this room about the significance of climate change. This council has been investing in mitigation measures for a number of years. Climate change, as we all know, is real. The good news is that there is a resiliency strategy coming back this term of this year. In fact, I think in the next quarter, that is going to speak to how it is that we can adapt our services and ensure that we address the reality of climate change. aging infrastructure. An organization like Toronto obviously has a wide expanse of infrastructure, not just what we look after directly, but also those of our agencies. And as we learned just recently how infrastructure costs can rise, and TTC brought forward a report, as many of you know, that demonstrates that the state of good repair for its assets have grown considerably to the point now that we are looking at in the next 15 years somewhere in the order of $33 billion of challenge. And so that, I think, along with other aspects of our infrastructure, does raise concern, I know, for all of you and certainly for us in management and our front line. So aging infrastructure, and of course with that, we need to make sure that our asset management program is as mature as possible. Housing, another area where we understand the price of housing here in Toronto has grown rapidly, and that there's a need to ensure that we have more affordable rental housing, as well as opportunities for those that find themselves in poor situations to be able to still be given shelter and looked after. So we know that housing is becoming an incredibly important commodity here in Toronto, and that is something that this council has and will continue to address. Mobility, we're growing by 1 million people in the next 20 years, and it's impossible to think that we're going to be able to accomplish all of that through the automobile, and for that reason we're looking to make heavy investments in transit. And so certainly whether it be subways or LRTs or streetcars or buses, all of that is going to be key. Plus the health of our citizens through cycling and through walking, another way in which we can benefit the people that live here. And of course, last but certainly not least, how do you pay for all of it? And certainly the Toronto Act does give us some tools that we can utilize and have been utilizing. But clearly, you know, as late as we've seen with the land transfer tax, where we had for years have been projecting increases, we finally experienced something that some had predicted, where there was in fact a decrease in the order of about $83 million. So, I mean, this all speaks to the fact that we need to bring back, and we will be bringing back this year, a long-term financial sustainability report that's going to give you some ideas as how it is that we're going to be able to maintain the 150 services that we provide. Next slide. So, of course, we did hear from the public. We heard from the committees, both the Budget and the Executive Committee. We had 167 deputations. We also had somewhere in the order of about 995 written submissions. That's not including what you heard in your offices. And additionally, we had over 10,000 hits on our website accessing our budget information. So when you take all of that and you put it into a word cloud, there's certain themes that tend to materialize, and those themes are in front of you. So if I get to the budget itself, the next slide, we have a $13.47 billion operating tax and rate-supported budget to present, as well as a $40,670 million 10-year capital tax and rate-supported budget. And so you notice at the very top it says the Executive Committee recommended balanced budget. There's an asterisk, and I'm going to speak to that in 1 second. If we can go to the next slide. Certainly the question is how is it that we are able to recommend that what we have is a balanced budget. So this slide you're going to see again in a few minutes when Heather gets up to speak to the details of this. But you know, of course, we were trying to achieve an increase in the order of inflation, and of course there is some impact to the water rates, solid waste rates, TTC fare increase, which hasn't occurred in a few years and of course is being recommended here. Then the matter of the federal government refugee contribution. So we have obviously seen a spike in refugees in this community, and this spike does not seem to be going away. In fact, I met with the Deputy Minister of Immigration federally to talk about this. And so we have what amounts to a $45 million pressure, where, like last year, we did see a $25 million commitment by the federal government to the City of Toronto in 2018. We believe, and there are negotiations going on between the Mayor, the Prime Minister, and the Minister regarding another payment that we are asking for in the order of $45 million. So we do expect that that will produce a positive result. But if in the event that it doesn't, we would then, if it falls short, we would then be in a position to come back to you with a report identifying very possibly a reserve that we could utilize to address this concern. So I just want to make that point to you. Of course, the solid waste rebate reduction, year one, it's a multi-year program. I'm not going to speak in detail because Heather will, of $35 million. And then the capital contribution reduction of $13 million over what was committed to in 2018. So I want to just very quickly speak to that. The reason why we are suggesting the $13 million decrease is because, first and foremost, there may be concerns that from a capital programming perspective in 2019, whether or not there's going to be concern as to we're going to get all those projects out. So we do not operate at 100% expenditure. We are in fact somewhere around the 70% figure when it comes to the amount of work that we're able to complete. So we don't believe that the $13 million reduction is going to in any appreciable way affect the amount of capital works we'll get out the door. But then there was another point that I want to raise, and that year after year we've increased this commitment by 10%, and so we're holding that commitment this year, and that commitment would be worth in the order of $35 million. So we are not putting forward an additional commitment in that regard. And then finally, a savings target, which is something that myself and our senior leadership team have looked at. It's what we believe is a reasonable target that we can address through the course of 2019. Through vacancies, some restructuring of our organization, and as well as looking at some of the contract work that we have and to see whether or not we can achieve the $10 million. We're quite confident, otherwise we wouldn't put it in front of you. Next slide. So with that, I just end with this final note, and this is a quote that comes from FCM. This is a submission that they're making to the federal government in advance of the March 19th budget presentation by the federal government, and it speaks to something I think we should all have regard for and take serious, and that there is a need for a new relationship, if you will, certainly with the federal government, and I would add to that the provincial government, as we try to not just maintain the services that we provide, but also continue to grow and contribute to this national provincial economy. And so I think the fact that the FCM is making a point of saying that the federal government should also clarify its readiness to continue a dialogue about a modernized fiscal relationship that empowers municipalities with tools to tackle a broad range of local identified priorities efficiently, cost-effectively, and robust planning horizons, speaks to the fact that there does need to be a dialogue, I think, with the federal and provincial government about not just how it is that it can help Toronto, but I would argue the Southern Ontario economy, which contributes significantly in terms of taxes to this country, to this province. So that's something that we will be identifying in more detail in our long-term financial strategy, and look very much forward to working with Council to advance this kind of idea. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Heather.
Through you, Madam Speaker, I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the Budget Chair, the Mayor, the Budget Committee, the Executive Committee, and of course the staff who have worked tirelessly. The staff are at all levels of this organization in all our service areas to help partner in developing this year's budget. The 2019 budget has been developed on a set of assumptions, and these assumptions have been influenced by priorities and recommendations from the public service, elected officials, and the public. The 2019 budget was developed around 5 guiding principles. Firstly, all programs and agencies have adopted equity-focused budgeting. Consideration has been given to potential equity impacts of new and enhanced investments and are included in program and agency budget notes. Secondly, due to the election and in the absence of council direction, we adopted the principle of introducing a cost of living increase, which has been consistent with practice over the last 4 years. Thirdly, the budget was created with the goal to preserve service levels, existing service levels that were provided in 2018. The budget also reflects the continued investment in strategies that were adopted in 2018. And finally, the 2019 budget considers ways to realize savings made possible via recommendations from the Auditor General. In years post an election, the City combines both its tax and rate-based budgets processes together. When you break down the $13.47 billion operating budget, you get the tax-supported budget of $11.59 billion. This is the portion funded primarily from property taxes. The rate-supported budget is $1.9 billion, and it is the portion for solid waste management, the Toronto Parking Authority, and Toronto Water, all of which are funded by their respective user fees. For the rate budget, in this combined process, the key rate changes are as follows. Council is considering a water rate increase of 3%. For the average Toronto household using 240 cubic meters of water, this will result in an annual increase of $27. The projected daily cost is $2.58. The projected total annual cost is $940. On the solid waste side, Council is considering a 2.2 blended rate increase for all the different types of customers as recommended by Executive and Budget Committees. A 2.2% blended rate increase is expected to generate an additional $10.8 million, retroactive to January 1st, 2019. On this slide, what I'd like to do is just highlight categories from where the city's revenue is generated and where funds are spent. So on the left, you can see that the top amount is your property tax. For 2019, the property tax revenues total $4.3 billion, and it reflects a residential property tax increase of 2.55%. The recommended cost of living increase results in additional $138 million, including assessment growth of $61 million. The next bucket of funding comes from other levels of government. This comprises 22.7% of the city's overall revenue. This revenue reflects grants and subsidies of $2.6 billion from other orders of government, which has helped to offset legislative programs such as social assistance, childcare, public health, and social housing, to name a few. 99.9% of the funding that is in the budget is based on signed agreements. The city has requested $45 million in federal funding to offset shelter costs for refugees. The continuation of, and it represents the continuation of federal funding of $8 million for social housing. In addition, a request of $10 million in funding from the province to assist with policing effectiveness and modernization. Thirdly, the TTC. Approved by the TTC board is a 10-cent TTC fare increase. The increase will generate additional fare revenue of $25.6 million. The fare revenue will offset the operating costs of the 2-hour time-based transfer and increase capacity to relieve overcrowding. Fares fund approximately 67% of the TTC's operating funding. Now, where does the money go? As you can see, the top line is cost-shared social programs. These include, but are not limited to, children's services, which is the Toronto's licensed childcare system that includes approximately 72,000 spaces for children from birth to 12 years, and long-term care homes. The TTC, who provides transit service 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, and emergency services, including police services, fire services, and paramedics. As I mentioned earlier, one of the guiding principles is that we would, in actual fact, continue on with strategies and investments made in 2018. This year's budget reflects $317 million in funding for programs reflecting strategies approved by Council and direction from Council to implement. The blue bars represent the investment that was made in 2018 that continues on in 2019. Major themes for these strategies are, in the area of poverty reduction and well-being, $187.7 million. This includes $73.5 million for childcare, representing 210 subsidies. Shelter costs of $45 million represents adding 4 additional shelter sites and to provide 24/7 respite care. Transit fare equity represents $10.6 million. In 2018, Phase 1 was to provide transit access for clients on ODSP and OW. In 2019, Phase 2 will provide a subsidy to clients with the childcare subsidy. In the area of city building and mobility, there's $70.9 million, which includes the 2-hour transfers, as I previously mentioned, in addition to $13.5 million of investments to release bus overcrowding. Environmental sustainability is $12.2 million, which includes Transform TO investments of $2.5 million and expansion of tree care and maintenance of $5 million. What I'm going to share a little bit more information on is how we're balancing. So as the city manager mentioned, we have identified strategies to balance expenditures and revenues for the 2019 budget. I'm going to go into detail in a few specific areas, but the highlights are the residential property tax increase of 2.55%. On a blended basis, it's 1.8%. A water rate increase of 3%. The solid waste rate increase of 2.2%. The TTC fare increase approved by their board of 10 cents per ride. The federal government refugee contributions of $45 million. The capital contribution reduction from 2018 of $13 million. The solid waste rebate reduction, year one, of $35 million, and a savings target. I'm going to go into detail in a few of these areas. With regards to shelters, the city has experienced a year-over-year increase of 100% in refugee accommodation. To offset the cost, the city has requested ongoing and stable funding of $45 million a year from the federal government. This assumption is included in the 2019 budget, since the city has received $26 million in federal funding and $3 million in provincial funding towards the costs the city incurred in 2018. The City of Toronto continues to request from both governments establish an effective regional strategy for Ontario that would improve intergovernmental collaboration and help manage increased volumes. With regards to MLTT, in prior years there have been discussions surrounding the unpredictability of MLTT revenue and the reliance on funding recurring operating expenses. In 2018, we experienced a reduction of $83 million over 2017. The experience in 2019 for January and February thus far has mirrored our 2018 experience. We do need a strategy to wean MLTT funding from funding city operations to MLTT funding capital projects. There will always be a portion of MLTT that is reliable, but anything beyond that can be dedicated to building capital infrastructure. So for 2019, we have reduced our annual contribution from our annual capital from current contribution by $13 million compared to 2018. This approach is based on evidence, based on our historical spending in the capital budget. We've identified that our capital plan, as mentioned in the beginning of this process, is an area of improvement. Josie will be elaborating on this shortly. The 2018 capital spend was 67% across all capital projects. And as directed by the Budget Committee, staff will endeavor to reassess the capital plan based on evidence such as historical spending. We are developing an asset management strategy, and we will examine our capital project management, our capacity, and the industry's capacity to improve our planning and spend rates on a go-forward basis. With regards to long-term waste, Council adopted the city's long-term waste management strategy in 2016. Which recommends that solid waste management services become a fully self-sufficient and sustainable utility, meaning the costs for garbage services are funded exclusively from garbage fees. The strategy from 2016 also set a goal of diverting 70% of Toronto's waste away from landfill by 2026. Most solid waste management services, single, family, and multi-residential ratepayers currently receive a rebate or credit on each utility bill. This is funded from the property taxes. The budget recommends that the solid waste rebate, single-family and multi-residentials, be completely phased out over the next 4 years. The proposed reductions to the single-family residential rebate in 2019 will provide an additional $35 million to the property tax budget and help achieve the city's diversion targets, which in 2017, our residential diversion rate was only 53%. To minimize the impact of reductions to the solid waste rebate on low-income ratepayers, Solid Waste Management Services is recommending a single-family residential low-income relief program, which will be incorporated into the existing water rebate program. With regards to the property tax, Police, TTC, and debt charges are the top three components of the property tax bill. The average tax bill in 2019 will be $3,020, an increase of $104 annually. And as you can see, 2/3 of your tax bill is dedicated to keeping the city safe, keeping the city moving, investing in building, maintaining, and enhancing the city's infrastructure. With regards to the 2019 tax rates, the 2019 proposed residential tax rate increase has kept in line with the cost of living increase of 2.55%. This cost of living increase is based on Stats Canada, the October 12-month trailing average of the Consumer Price Index for Toronto. Commercial tax rate increase is 1.28%, which continues the policy of increasing the tax rate equal to 50% of the residential tax rate. The multi-residential tax remains the same level as 2018, which continues the policy of freezing tax rates, and 0.85% for industrial, increasing by 1/3 compared to the residential increase. What we've talked about so far are the tax rates to support the 2019 budget levy. This slide shows the cumulative impact on the residential tax bill. What these stacked bars represent is the basis of the tax rate, which is the 2.55% mentioned for the entire residential class. There is also a 0.5% city building fund levy that started in 2017 to fund priority transit and housing capital projects as approved by City Council. Council approved a 0.5% dedicated tax beginning in 2017 for 5 years to create $1 billion in debt room for additional investment opportunities. The top portion of the bar is the current value assessment impact. Property values reassessments are conducted on a 4-year cycle, with CVA increases being phased in equal increments in each year of the 4-year phase-in period. The city's $40.7 billion 10-year capital budget and plan will guide decisions on what investments will be made for Toronto's future. In order to reduce the city's reliance on MLTT, staff have been directed to reassess the 10-year capital budget and plan to develop strategies to increase funding for the capital budget that include developing an approach to reducing the city's reliance on the MLTT revenue for operating expenses and redirect MLTT funds to capital projects. Also, a review of the 10-year capital plan cash flows, project timelines, and consideration for historical spending rates. The city and industry's capacity to deliver projects will enable the city to absorb the $13 million C4C reduction for 2019. The Budget Committee has also directed the CFO and Treasurer to increase funding for the capital budget by developing strategies to maximize the use of development charges, reinvest proceeds from the sale of city assets, and partner with other levels of government and the private sector. As required by provincial legislation, the city will also update its asset management policies, standards, and practices and report back with an asset management policy for council approval in July 2019. With more accurate information, the city will be in a better position to address funding requirements for maintenance, service, improvement, and growth. So now I'm going to pass it over to Josie Levita, Executive Director of Financial Planning, to walk you through the capital budget.
Thank you, Heather. Through the chair, Mr. Mayor Tory, members of council, good morning. So I'm here to provide you with a bit of a top-line overview on the 10-year capital plan that's before you. Okay, next slide. Great, okay. So this 10-year capital plan's just over $40.5 billion. That's for both tax and rate. When you look to your left-hand side of the slide, we've got our rate programs worth about almost $14.5 billion. That's for Toronto Water, Solid Waste, Toronto Parking Authority, and for our tax support, it is $26.2 billion. Very similar to last year's 10-year capital plan. Next slide. So let's just spend a moment on the rate program. So what we have here is is a slide that provides the 10-year program by the different project categories that we have. $14.5 billion is fully funded from the rates that we generate, the funds that we generate from the fees. Unlike other municipalities, there is no debt associated with these programs. So by project category, you can see the 4 bar charts. I'm just going to take a moment on 2 of them. The second one is state of good repair. That's worth about $7 billion, and the lion's share of that, of course, is Toronto Water, with fairly significant investments being made in the rehabilitation and replacement of our water mains, our treatment plants, and our sewer systems, as well as solid waste management's transfer stations and yards and facilities. On the service improvement side, which is the next bar, that's worth about $4.5 billion, and again, it's mostly attributable to Toronto Water's investments that were being made in basement flooding protection, wet weather flow, and another $1 billion for our Don River and Central Waterfront trunk and sewer outfall program. But built into that as well is a $12.5 million expansion for our bike share program at the Toronto Parking Authority and the continuation of our waste management strategy. Next slide. So now we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about the tax capital plan. And so I'd like to draw your attention to that. So it's $26.2 billion. And as you can see from this chart, that about 70% of it, or $18 billion, is being dedicated to our mobility program. That's a combination of our transit expansion funding, TTC, base funding, and of course transportation services. So what's built into there? So of course we have funding in there in our transit expansion program to continue with our Smart Track project, our Scarborough Subway, of course. We have relief line accelerated planning money that's in there so we can move forward on that project. And there's some planning work for the Waterfront LRT and, of course, the closeout of the Toronto-York Spadina Extension project. When we talk about the TTC, this is their base program, and a lot of it is going to buildings and structures, the purchase of vehicles, and of course our easier access program to ensure that we're compliant with AOTA requirements by 2025. But also, and then in transportation, we've got the Gardner that's being funded out of there, and fairly significant investments being made in our local road, our major roads, our city bridges, our Vision Zero and city cycling plans. So while we have identified those particular programs, just want to draw your attention to 2 other areas. So in Parks, Forestry and Recreation, $1.9 billion, and built into that is about $500 million in funding so that we can continue and start work on the master facilities plan that Parks, Forestry and Recreation brought in. So that's the growth program. So that's been built in. And in our shelter and support and housing, the almost $1 billion in that capital plan is to continue acquiring the 1,000 beds that Council approved last year, George Street Revitalization Project, and of course our commitment to funding for the TCHC of $173 million. So on the right side of this slide is our funding sources, but I'm going to focus on that in a different slide. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So our 10-year capital plan, very similar to last year. It's about $800 million different, and most of that is coming from these new investments that we were able to bring in to this program. So through efforts that we did during the budget process, we looked at how we can align our project funding and our timelines and looked at some other ways of dealing with our funding sources. It gave us some capacity to add $785 million. The funding that we did provide, the capacity that we did provide, allowed us to include these very critical projects, but as you can see, it's really only a top-level ability to contribute to some of the key priorities that the city has. So, of course, we did try to bring the funding, our share of the funding, for a 50-50% cost-shared initiative for the relief line, for some critical bridge rehabilitation. Transportation has done some work there, and so we're able to provide additional investment, buy some more buy some more buses, and deal with some revitalization projects, whether it's in public spaces or in our facilities, and continue our modernization program. And then finally at the bottom, there is funding there to continue to ensure that we are compliant with AOTA legislation and to deal with the high lake effect flooding damage and windstorm damage experienced in the last couple of years. Next slide. So what this slide does is it provides us with the annual planned expenditures by year. So if we look to the left, what you can see is the 2019 capital budget. That's $2.9 billion, so that is actually what you're approving for funding this year and the work that people will be undertaking. And when we add the carry-forward funding that from unspent projects last year, it's over $4 billion. And then the next point that I'd like to focus on is really how are we doing in our state of good repair funding, because that has been a priority for council. So as you can see in the circled area, it's $12.8 billion, or 49%. That is a priority, and it represents about half of the funding in the overall capital plan. When you then compare that and look at what we did back in 2011, the total 10-year capital plan at that point was $12.8 billion, and that is exactly what we're funding. So 100% of what we did in 2011 is just going to state of good repair in 2019. When you then take really the health and safety, the legislated, and state of good repair together, because in some way they are all state of good repair, just at different levels of severity or compliance, it's almost 55%. And then when you look at our service improvement and growth combined, that's worth $11.8 billion, or 45%. So what is this telling us? Essentially, what we've tried to do in this 10-year capital plan is balance about half of it towards ensuring that our current assets are maintained in a state of good repair so we can assure the reliability of our current service delivery, but also help the city plan for the future to deal with service improvements and growth in the city. Next slide. So one of the key issues, as I mentioned, is the state of good repair backlog. So I'd like to spend a minute on how well we're doing. So annually, as a city, what we try to do is track the extent to which our capital funding is actually having an impact on our state of good repair. It is a priority with $12 billion, but what we can see is that, in fact, you know, we continue to be challenged, as Chris mentioned. So if we were to have $100 that we needed to actually spend, but the capital plan only allowed us to spend $80, that $20 that we are not spending gets added to or accumulated to the amount of spending that we should be doing to ensure that those assets are maintained. So when you look at this, and it represents both our tax and rate supported program, what you see is a red line, which is the actual value of that state of good repair backlog, and it's increasing from $7.8 billion to up to $9.5 billion. But as a percentage of our asset value, which is about $96 billion, it's going from 8.2% to 8.8%. So we think, okay, this is contained, we're managing it. But when you pull back, two significant investments that the city has made, one in our Toronto Water program, which is the funding of our sewage infrastructure and the revitalization of our Gardiner Expressway, what you're seeing is a slightly different picture. That red line is now much steeper. And in fact, it's much steeper than it was in 2018, and there are some reasons for that. What we have done this year is we've added the backlog values for our Toronto Community Housing Corporation, which we've never had built into these estimates. But in addition, as we do mature our asset management practices, staff in our agencies and divisions are in fact updating the condition of their audits, and so what we're getting is increased values of our assets, and we're also getting changes to the condition. And so those together are having an impact on that overall state. And when we look at what's driving us, you can see from this slide, yeah, next slide, thanks Eric, where we are having the greatest amount of growth. So in transportation, I mean, all of these have red arrows going up. You can see what's happening there. But for transportation, we now have additional bridges that we're having to deal with. The TTC estimates here do not include the capital investment plan that they've just identified. We will be working with them and updating that information for next year. Toronto Parks, Forestry and Recreation, and Toronto Public Library continue to be areas that we're focusing, and we're able to give a bit more money to the public library this year. And the Toronto Community Housing estimates that are built in here are the raw data information, and I just want to be clear that this information is here showing what the impact would be in the absence of any additional funding from the city or other orders of government. We are working on a strategy, and we've been working with the federal government on an application that allows us some eligibility for funding. So we'll be coming back during 2019 and in time for the 2020 budget with a funding strategy for that. Next slide. So here are the funding sources, also provided over a 10-year period. So I just really want to draw your attention to the very last row, which shows the 10-year total and percentage. So when you combine the federal and provincial amounts, it represents about 31%. Our development charges at 8%, much higher than prior years. And in fact, back in 2011, on that chart that you're seeing it below that, we're at about 4%. So we have more projects in the pipeline that are for growth purposes, but also we have higher values that we're now able to contribute to the program. Our reserve and reserve funds at $2.8 billion is fairly significant as well, and what that's reflecting is funding of almost $900 million for our capital financing reserve. So as we've had non-debt financing strategies, like putting our surpluses into a reserve, the 75%, putting dividends in there, we're able now to put that back into the capital program, and we're investing and using that money to fund actual TTC and transportation projects. Our recoverable debt, which is 8% or $2.1 billion, that represents the use of our city building fund money that is being levied, and we're treating that as the repayment of debt, and that in fact is helping us fund our Smart Track program. And then finally, when you combine our capital from current and debt funding, together they represent 39%. Next slide. So what's the impact on the debt that's being planned in this program on our debt servicing? So much like an individual who goes to the bank to try to borrow for a mortgage, there's an assessment of what level of income can actually support the repayment of the principal and the interest amounts. So our debt servicing, which is the repayment of both those, are guided by our ability to pay for that. And so the policy that Council has is that no more than 15% of our property tax income should go towards our debt servicing. So this guideline that we use is the one that helps us guide our debt affordability. For 2019, in this 10-year plan, our debt service ratio has been contained to 14.93%. But if you look at this graph and its profile, you can see that it's quite low in year one and it's quite low in the outer 2 years, and that's what's allowed us to stay under the 15%, because we are peaking up towards 16% through the mid part of this, given the various investments that we have. So in addition to what else we are funding, we also have a list of things that are not funded. And so we've talked about, through this process, the unmet capital needs. They are growing, and we do need additional funding strategies. And this slide just gives you a sense of the scope of things that we're looking at. So every year we ask staff to highlight them and identify them, and to the extent that we have funding capacity, we bring in what we can. There was a briefing note that we did for the Budget Committee that said, based on what we have identified, in the 10-year period, we have unfunded needs of about $12 billion, and over the 15-year period for those projects that are completing in the outer 5 years, another $13.6 billion that needs about $9 billion of investment. But what's not included in those numbers is the addition of the information coming from the TTC, from their State of Good Repair, transit expansion numbers, which there is a report coming in April that will be outlining those estimates, secondary master and service plans, for which work is underway in many areas to identify what those costs are, any emergent citywide or local priorities for which councillors and staff are working on opportunities for revitalization or collaboration, and any new projects beyond the 10-year period. So having said all that, what we identified, and as Heather outlined, is the need to be able to take some actions. And in fact, both Budget Committee and Executive Committee have recommended those actions to you at Council, and essentially looking at our ability to take another look at this 10-year capital plan, given our capital spending, and to mature our asset management practices together, how we deliver, how we manage our assets, and how we then plan and budget and execute are really integral to ensuring that we are allocating the money in our best way so that we can actually complete what we're doing. Secondly, when we think about all the plans that we have, whether it's through official planning, whether it's through service planning, and of course through capital planning, we need the ability to really integrate that so we can start thinking about what's first, second, and third, and then setting up all the many priorities and some kind of a sense for council so we can set up those citywide priorities and then build the various funding strategies that are outlined on this slide. So as a result, this is work that we will be doing. given the direction if council approves these directions today, and we will be coming back starting with the 2020 budget process to do that. And with that, Madam Chair, I'd like to conclude our presentation.
Thank you. Okay, so on EX 2.1, we're at that item. Are there any questions? Well, put your name up. No, this is just on 2.1, which is the tax rate. Councillor Perks.
I'm not sure who to ask, maybe the CFO. If property, as there is a provincial restriction that says that property taxes cannot be increased on tenants who live in apartment buildings. Is that correct? Someone just...
Correct.
So if we increase property taxes, the people who are in those buildings aren't affected?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
So if we increase property taxes, the people who are tenants in big apartment buildings aren't affected?
That is correct.
Okay. For the people who do own property, though, any increase in property taxes is proportionate directly to the value of the house.
That's correct.
That's correct. In terms of the services people consume, many of the services that we deliver are ineligible. People are ineligible if they have high incomes. Our transit low-income pass, our welcome policy and recreation, fee subsidy for childcare, etc. Right? We have many programs like that.
That is correct.
If I'm someone who owns a property that is twice the value of someone else in the City of Toronto, I don't get premium service in, say, firefighting or policing or whatever. I get the same service.
That is correct.
Thank you very much. To Ms. Levita, if my memory serves, the last time the City of Toronto did a long-term financial plan was 2005 that came to Council?
That's correct.
That's correct. And in that, we identified at that time that in order to carry the suite of services we had then and the capital, maintain our capital program and build for growth, we would need all the revenue tools we currently have plus the sales tax.
That's correct. We had a scorecard on that.
We had a scorecard, and you know, we ticked off. We got the land transfer tax, and we ticked off that we got the GST, got excluded from GST for TTC. We ticked off the vehicle registration. I believe there was something in there also about keeping property taxes current with our spending program. That's my memory.
I don't recall that one in particular, but we were looking at how we grow our revenues in general.
But the point was that to keep the suite of programs that we had and to build for a growing city, we needed more revenue than we had at that time. That was the point.
Through you, yes.
And we never did finish ticking off all the sources of revenues that we said we needed to maintain the suite of services we have and accommodate the growth of the city. We never finished that checklist.
We did not, although there was a campaign to try to.
There was, I remember that campaign, the 1 cent now. Where am I? Okay, I think that's fine. Thank you.
Cute. Councillor Layton, questions?
Yes, thank you very much. I guess this is to the CFO. I'm really encouraged to see that the recoverable debt line is starting to appear in our documents and grow. First, my question is, I just want to make sure we're using it correctly, because we had the hard fight to prove that we could start demonstrating that recoverable debt shouldn't count towards the debt ceiling. Like, this was a hard fight a couple years ago. I don't know if staff have given you the background, but so. Can you explain how this is funding transit work through the city building fund? Because that wouldn't seem to me to actually be the intent of how recoverable debt should be calculated.
Through Madam Speaker, when there is a predictable revenue stream that is associated with a specific project, that revenue, in actual fact, can be the funding source for the debt repayment. Therefore, with regards to the debt, it is not included in the debt service costs. It's included in our recoverable debt.
So how is it that we're using the, are we using the city building fund as our steady revenue stream, predictable revenue stream? Because it's anything but predictable. This council could just decide to remove it tomorrow.
Do you want to say that?
I get it, and Mr. Mayor, I'm not trying to criticize its use. I just want to make sure when we come up with other projects that we're using it correctly, because this was supposed to be stuff like energy efficiency, which was a predictable thing that would return on that investment. And I would actually argue that transit fares may and should contribute and cause our transit projects to come off.
Councillor Layton, I believe the staff that wants to respond.
Through the Speaker, certainly this is the third tranche of a city building fund that will be considered today. Once it's adopted by Council, it's effectively built into the tax base, and forever and a day we'll be getting that steady stream of revenue to offset the debt.
So because we're passing this 0.5% today, that's the revenue stream that can be depended on.
That's correct, yes.
So it's we're paying by tranche. So next year, when we say we're adding these projects, that 0.5% will count towards recoverable debt, and will be added into the base as on a go-forward basis.
Through the Speaker, that's absolutely correct.
Oh, okay, very interesting. So still on the recoverable debt point, because now we've changed the definition as of 2019, have we gone back and sort of retrospectively looked at the investments debt-related investments for the past decade, for instance, for things like energy efficiency projects? Is it possible for us to look backwards and take some of that debt-funded work that's sitting on our books and slide it over to recoverable debt and free up some room within the debt ceiling? Do you understand? Does that make any sense?
So through Madam Chair, in fact, we continue with that same practice. So if you look at the Transform TO capital program, it is a recoverable debt program. And so we are actually issuing debt on their behalf because there's a recovery through the energy efficiency. So that still is going on. So we have, brought in a lot more clarity around the definition of what is recoverable debt, and it has to be predictable by virtue of demonstration of a stream of revenue or savings.
But can we look backwards and retroactively deem debt that we've already accumulated as recoverable if it produced a specific revenue stream?
We could, and
like I'm just thinking the chillers that were replaced in arenas that were more energy efficient. A portion of that might, like it's an accounting exercise, but it may free up some space in that debt ceiling.
And through you, Madam Chair, we did do that when we set those programs up. So they were some of our very earliest recoverable debt programs. Okay,
so I had thought that because the definition changed this year, that we weren't doing that.
No, in fact,
I must have been wrong.
Yeah, our first one was the Yorkville BIA $20 million loan program.
Okay. So one last question. This is on how much of the transfer of the solid waste rebate this year, next year, and the following year would that represent as a proportion of property taxes? So if we were to instead institute a property tax increase, then remove the solid waste rebate, what would that equal in the next 3 years?
It's approximately 1% on an annual basis.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cole.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Whether this goes to the Director of Budget or whether it goes to the Chief Financial Officer, my question is in terms of the capital investments in infrastructure. Could you put that up on the board for me? The different areas where we're investing in our infrastructure, in our roads, sewers. Anyway, so while you're putting that up, what I'm trying to find out is that I don't see a place where we look at investments in our natural infrastructure. Like we look at investments in our sewer system, and our roads, and our public transit. how do we find out how much money we are putting into enhancing, expanding, sustaining our natural infrastructure, like our ravine system, our natural
Councillor
sewers?
Cole,
Yes.
Councillor Cole, I'm sorry, but we are just on 2.1, which is the tax rate.
Yeah, well,
No, but you have a chance when we get to the other item, Tassel specifics.
it was just up on the board. It was
No,
just up on the screen.
yeah,
I'm just
but-
questioning what was up on the screen.
No, but the presentation that was made earlier with staff, no questions on that. We are at 2.1, which is the tax rate right now. And when we get to the other item, then you can ask specifics.
Okay, how about this? Another question I had. In terms of the impact on the tax rate, we talked about debt charges and sources of revenue, et cetera. One source of revenue that's been noted in the documents is the tax increment financing for the smart stations. Can you explain to me how much money we've gotten from this tax increment financing for building our infrastructure?
Again, we're at the tax rate.
I'm listening, Joe.
Through the Speaker, last year Council adopted a revenue-generating tool to help offset and fund Smart Track, the Smart Track initiative, and that included allocating a portion of the future streams from future development along the Smart Track corridor to fund the debt service associated with our share of the Smart Track program.
Thank you. We are at the tax rate. Questions only related to tax rate. Councillor Pasternak? On the tax rate.
Understood, Madam.
Okay.
Thank you very much. On the tax rate. So I've got some letters here that I guess constituents have forwarded. People in enormous distress. It's a notice of issuance to bailiff, people who are on the verge of losing their homes. I guess these are letters from our revenue services to homeowners who can't pay their current taxes. They've fallen further and further behind. Are we getting an increasing number of these letters, or maybe it's just a Ward 6 thing?
I've got a few, James.
Councillor, happy to look into that. We don't have, oh, sorry, Casey?
Through you, Madam Speaker. In fact, the number of property tax accounts that are in arrears has been reduced in the past year in comparison to previous years.
Now, the Toronto Real Estate Board estimates that foreclosures in Toronto are up 24%, 2017, 2018. Does that figure gel with yours, or is that?
We do not track foreclosures on mortgages.
Because usually the tax arrears goes down with the foreclosure. It all goes down, everything.
Yes, and as I said, what we're seeing is a reduction in the total receivables outstanding. So we're not seeing an increase, we're seeing a decrease in the last year.
So an increase in foreclosures according to the Toronto Real Estate Board, but a decrease in distress tax arrears.
In taxes outstanding. So people are in fact paying their property taxes through our collection efforts, through the efforts of the bailiff. So we are in fact following council-approved procedures to send these to the bailiff for collection, and that collection, our collection efforts have been successful.
Okay, we'll leave that for now. Through you, through the Speaker, to I guess the CFO, and I ask this every year. Are we still putting a little slip in our tax bills to give the good people of Toronto an opportunity to pay more taxes if they so desire?
Through you, Madam Chair, this year, for the first year, we have not included a buck slip for voluntary contributions because the voluntary contribution program is now completely online. So we don't need people to send in checks. They can donate online, and that information is contained on the tax bill and in the tax bill brochure about making a voluntary contribution.
So if my notes are correct, that used to go out to about a million households, and that we collected $25,000 to $30,000. Does that?
That is correct.
So, so we have an opportunity. So Torontonians, in essence, have an opportunity to pay more taxes if they so desire.
They may make a voluntary contribution, yes, and they can direct their contribution to the program of their choice. That part of the program has not changed.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next question is Councillor Carroll.
Yes, I'm looking through the report. There are a number of charts here that show us how we've broken down the classes, but what I don't see is an update on the Enhancing Toronto's Business Climate Shift. Where are we at? Because we extended it, I've lost track of where we are in achieving that shift. Can someone give me an idea of the ratio between commercial and single-family dwelling residential now?
Through you, Madam Chair. That's on Table 7 of the report that's before you.
Right here.
And it's the tax ratio projections. For 2019, our projected ratios are about 2.7 times for industrial and commercial. And for multi-res, we're actually below our target of 2.5 now. We're at 2.46.
Could you tell me what page it's on? Because I don't see the page 13. They're not the tables aren't numbered here. They're just included in the body. Okay, so 2.7, and the goal is to get where? Here it is. Thank you. So the goal is to get to 2.5. And we're at 2.7. Am I reading that right?
That's correct.
So we're at a point now where we're very close to that. If we were looking to adjust the rates, and I'm a realist, we've adopted the order paper, we're going to adopt this item, and then we're going to go on to do the budget after. Twas ever thus. But what I want to ask is, if we took the feedback we got this year and we agreed that we've got to start to look at this, is there a flexibility here given that we have been in the city building levy, building the shift in? We add a 0.5 to the residential, we only add a 0.35 to business. If we wanted now to capture some more revenue, and we agree that we have a pretty healthy business climate, could we stretch out that last 0.2? Could we stretch out that shift across the tax rates, capture the revenue that we might need to fill the gap? There is a gap in this budget as we adopt it today.
Through the chair, that's a policy decision for council.
And it's a council decision. There's no legislative impediment to us playing a little with that between now and 2020, 2023, where we want to be at goal. We could play with the bands a little bit, achieve this shift, but in a different way to capture a little bit of revenue out of commercial.
Through the chair, you can't increase ratios, but what we could do is...
That's the piece. We can't increase the ratio, but we can slow down how we reduce it. That's the only impediment we have. Am I right?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Councillor Wong-Tam.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and through you to our staff. With respect to the tax rate that the City of Toronto established today, how do we compare with other municipalities in the GTA? Are we on the highest end, somewhere in the middle, somewhere at the very end, lowest?
Through you, Madam Speaker, the City of Toronto is towards the lower end.
And we're towards the lower end, and so therefore we technically have one of the lowest residential tax rates in all of the GTA. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And with respect to Toronto's competitiveness in attracting residents to the city, is it oftentimes referred as perhaps the city property taxes are too high, and that's why people don't move to the City of Toronto? Or is it because transit is lacking, or perhaps the cost of overall housing is too high? What are the reasons that residents people are not coming to the City of Toronto to choose as their home? Is it the cost of our residential property tax?
Through you, Madam Speaker, the reason for people finding challenging affordability in Toronto is not limited to property taxes.
but we do hear about the difficulties of living in a city that's increasingly unaffordable, and oftentimes it's quoted to the cost of food, the cost of transportation. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so, if we have the ability to raise our property tax, so we can actually gap some of the components that people will consider what makes a more livable city, would that make Toronto a more attractive city overall for businesses to come and locate here, so that their employees and future residents of Toronto will find this to be a more friendlier city for them?
Through you, Madam Speaker, I'm sorry, I can't comment on that.
Okay, thank you. With respect to the ability to raise our property tax, if we were to increase the property tax by even 1%, what quantum will that bring in for us?
Through you, Madam Speaker, 1% is approximately equal to $30 million.
And that $30 million through that 1% increase, what are some of the items that are currently not included in the city budget because we just don't have the funding to support those services?
Through you, Madam Speaker, as we presented or launched the budget approximately a month ago, one of the guiding principles was ensuring that strategies that were implemented in 2018 were carried into 2019 and became part of the base budget. In addition to that, there were very limited new and enhanced, because the focus wasn't looking at new and enhanced services. So my understanding is that we have actually continued on with programs that existed in 2018 and continued on with the service levels from 2018.
Thank you for that reply. I think that we have also I think there's also been some identification in the budget that perhaps not everything is entirely funded, although strategies have been announced, press conferences have been held. So for example, the youth equity strategy, I know there's been lots of talk about whether or not we can adequately fund that to meet the criteria of the community. That is not entirely funded in this 2019 budget, is that correct?
Actually, through you, Madam Speaker, the youth equity, the youth strategy was fully funded in the 2019 budget.
And what was the overall quantum of the youth equity strategy? What was the entire costed valuation of that youth equity strategy?
Through the Speaker, $2.6 million has been added this year or in the budget before you. Much of the strategy did not have specific financial implications. And I will get you the total figure.
Okay. That's a very important answer that we'll need, because I do believe that there has been some discussions about whether, number one, there's confusion about the actual quantum, the valuation of the entire program, and then two, exactly whether it's funded or not funded. I've never seen such chaos through this chamber about whether something's been adequately funded.
There was a briefing note submitted to Budget Committee. That briefing note identified in detail the investments, cumulative investments from 2015 to 2019 at a value of $61 million. That note is before Council.
Thank you. Just final question. Is Transform TO, the strategies to reduce gun violence, the tenant hotline, the tenant defense fund, the rent bank, the trustee program, the enhanced spaces, are those programs funded right now?
Yeah, okay. Councillor Fillion.
Thank you.
Questions? We're at the tax rate.
Yeah,
we're at the tax rate.
Finance staff.
Okay.
To what extent do changes in interest rates affect the capital budget that's before us and our ability to fund it?
Through you, Madam Speaker, an increase in interest rates would impact our calculation of our 15% debt ceiling expense. So, as mentioned by Josie, the 15% is calculated on a 10-year average. So if there was an increase in interest rates, our cost to service that particular debt would go up and impact our 15%.
Which would then squeeze items out of we would be able to fund less through the 15%. Right. And what assumptions are we making about interest rates?
Our assumptions, through the Speaker, our assumptions, in actual fact, are informed by our investment consortium that we deal with from a Toronto investment perspective. We actually, if you'd like to add to this, we in actual fact have predictions that are well informed from the banking community.
Yes, if I could just supplement, we have a debt syndicate that acts on our behalf in the issuance of debt, and we, on an annual basis, poll them, as well as their economists, for interest rate predictions over the short and longer term. And that is the feedback that we take into our modeling for debt service, as well as the debt guidelines.
So it's possible we could be surprised, but it's relatively unlikely?
My suggestion is that we often use a very conservative approach to the debt guidelines and the debt service forecast, and so we ought not be surprised.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Grimes on the tax rate.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to follow up on Councillor Wong-Tam's questions about Toronto being the lowest tax rate, I guess, let's call it the region. Why would perhaps Whitby or Milton or Innisfil, why would their rates be a lot higher than ours?
I think through the Speaker, there are a variety of reasons. It could be that the services that are provided by those municipalities, for whatever reason, cost more than our jurisdiction. It could be that they have a lower commercial industrial tax base than the City of Toronto that often subsidizes the residential. So it's for a variety of reasons.
Would it be safe to say that in the City of Toronto, our pools and our arenas, our libraries have probably been paid over 10, 20 times over for it, right? So you've got Milton, Whitby building on farmland. They don't have these services, so to build these libraries, these pools, these new arenas, that's the reason they'd have higher taxes. Would that be a safe assumption?
So again, there are a number of factors. I mean, these jurisdictions have access to development charges, which help fund some of those growth-related capital costs. But on the operating side,
some, but not all.
That's correct.
Okay, those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. To speak, Councillor Perks.
Thank you, Speaker. I do have a motion. I'm sure you're all shocked. If I could have it up. Speaker, I'm moving essentially that there be a 2% increase on the property tax rate beyond what's in front of us for the residential category and proportionate increases for the other categories. So 1% on industrial, 1% on commercial, in addition to what is in front of us. I'm doing this for a very important reason, and to get to that reason, I want to start with something the Mayor said. The Mayor has said today and on many other occasions that keeping property taxes low makes Toronto more affordable. And I take issue with that. I actually think that the facts support exactly the opposite view. You heard me ask questions of city staff, and we heard that when property taxes increase, tenants living in apartment buildings do not pay more. You heard also that the property tax rate is linear, that is perfectly related to the value of the property you own. The more wealth you have, the more you pay. You also heard that services, that's what property taxes pay for, services tend to help people with lower incomes and less wealth slightly more than they help people with lots of wealth. That's because we offer programs that are tailored specifically to people with low incomes, things like the transit pass for people with low incomes, things like fee subsidies at daycare, things like the welcome policy in our recreation services. You also heard that if you pay twice as much property tax, you don't get twice as much fire service. You don't get twice as much access to public transit. If property taxes grow faster than inflation, the services grow, and that helps low-income people. If property taxes grow faster than inflation, the people who benefit are the people who are struggling to live in Toronto, to afford living in Toronto the most. If property taxes are below inflation, the people who benefit the most are the people who own the most wealth. It is actually the case that if you keep property taxes going down on a per capita basis, as this council has done in the last 8 budgets and will do in this one, you are helping wealthy people and hurting people with low incomes. If instead you do, as the City Council decided to do the last time we actually had a long-term financial plan, which was 2005, and invest in the services that help people with low incomes the most, and invest in building the infrastructure necessary for a growing population, you make Toronto more affordable. The mayor is exactly wrong when he says keeping property taxes low makes the city affordable. What it does is make the city unaffordable for people who don't have wealth and let those people who do have wealth hang on to it. It's exactly the opposite of what a progressive city should be doing to invest in its future. That's the first thing I want in our minds as we vote on the property tax rate. The second thing to have in mind when we vote on the property tax rate is Council was told the last time we had a debate on the long-term financial health in the City of Toronto, 2005, that we desperately needed more revenue if we were going to keep the suite of services that we had intact and if we were going to build the city for a growing population. We were told that 14 years ago, the last time we ever debated it. And the decision was, by Council, that we needed to increase our revenues to get there. We did that to a certain extent. We put in the land transfer tax, and I'm sure everybody here thanks their lucky stars every day they come to work. We did that. We put in the vehicle registration fee, and we started pursuing the sales tax. In the last 9 years, we've gone the other way. We took out the vehicle registration fee, and we've stopped the campaign that we had to bring in the sales tax. What that means is, as was presented by Ms. Levita when looking at the capital budget, we continue to fall behind. Our future ability to deliver the services we need, our roads, our libraries, our recreation services, our community housing, we are falling behind on those. And we're falling behind because this council keeps insisting that protecting the wealthiest Torontonians is the most important thing to do, and providing for the future of the City of Toronto is not. So I plead with you, help make this a fairer and more sustainable city. Invest in the City of Toronto. Support the property tax motion I put.
Thank you. Questions, clarification, Councillor Holyday.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think it's just one question. I just want to understand Councillor Perks's intent here further, and the councillor's speech alluded to it. Is the primary role of this government to move wealth amongst people, or is it to provide services? We talked a lot about wealth.
Yes, and what I was saying is that when we provide services, it is natural that there is a redistributive effect of that. The two are inextricably linked. That's what governments do. When you provide services that people universally have access to, sidewalks, there is, depending on your revenue source, there is a natural redistributive effect. So part of the decision we make when we keep property taxes below inflation is that we help the people who have wealth and fail to deliver the services to everybody else.
So the movement of wealth through the services is the intent of the design of those services. Is that your philosophy on this? And
no,
hence the rationale to
no, I did not say that was
the numbers.
So Councillor, to be very clear, I want to answer your question as directly as possible.
Absolutely.
It is not the intent of those programs, or the fact that we are a government delivering services. It is a secondary and natural consequence. If I simply wanted to move wealth from one group of people to another, I would be at a different order of government proposing different kinds of measures. But I want us to understand that a consequence of squeezing the budget that we have year after year that provides services and keeping it at inflation or below is that we hurt the people in the most need. And I wanted to say that specifically because the mayor keeps insisting that keeping property taxes below inflation makes the city affordable, when in fact the opposite is the case.
Now, at the opening of the questions, I asked whether or not you felt that the role of this government is to transfer wealth from one group to the other. I think you said yes.
No, what I said is it's a natural consequence.
Okay, so your belief is that that's not necessarily the role of the municipal government, it's a consequence of the services.
The municipal government has a great many different roles and services that it provides. Some of them, which I believe you have voted for, are specifically about helping people who are in poverty or in low-income circumstances, providing affordable housing, providing shelter space, providing access to recreation through the welcome policy. Many of those things are built into the budget. Council does, for some of the programs, deliberately say, you know what, if you've fallen behind for whatever reason, we believe as a society we should be helping you. The point I am making...
Thank you. Thank you. Time's up.
Okay.
We do have another question. Councillor Wong Tam, 3 minutes clarification of the motion.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and through you to Councillor Perks. The mayor had campaigned on keeping taxes relatively low or close to the rate of inflation. What you're proposing with your motion contradicts the mayor's campaign pledge. Is that not correct?
Yes.
And do you believe that you have the authority, or at least the moral authority, just as the mayor will probably say, that he won a campaign, he won an election, so therefore he has the authority to proceed with his direction to keeping taxes at the rate of inflation?
So I think our minds should be very clear on this point. First of all, I remember very clearly the day I went and voted. There was no referendum on this question or any other where we got specific instructions from the City of Toronto. I also think we should turn our minds back to one of the early council meetings at the beginning of last term. If you remember, in the previous election, the mayor had an element of his campaign right there on his lawn signs and all of his literature and his ads called Smart Track. And in that election, he said that he would deliver 22 stations within 7 years. We're very nearly at 7 years, by the way. And that it would be at subway prices and subway frequency, and that the City of Toronto would not have to pay a cent because it would all be paid by tax increment financing. Every single one of those things is not happening. And the mayor actually had the good grace to stand up and say, I know I campaigned on this, but I got bad advice from my advisors, and I've since learned that it's important that we not build the western leg because it's not technically possible, and we can't do the 22 stations. And I think governing properly is more important than tying yourself to a campaign promise that was wrong.
Thank you, Councillor Perks. Would this tax increase to the rate, would it reverse the TTC 10-cent fare hike that will go into effect in April?
So what I have done is put out a number for the tax rate by itself. Unfortunately, despite my request, the mayor continues to insist that we debate the revenue and expenditure apart from each other, which means I don't allocate where the $60 million or so that my motion would bring in would go, but instead it would come over into the next debate, and then we could debate where to put it.
Okay, so it could potentially reverse.
Absolutely, it could do that.
The mayor's election promises also contained 7,200 new units of supportive housing, 1,000 new shelter beds in 2019, 157,000 new low-income adults to receive reduced TTC fares, 5,000 more affordable child care subsidies.
Okay, Councillor Wong Tam, it was on clarification of the motion.
I
That's your last question.
My motion,
we're not to go.
As it pertains to that.
Yeah.
So yes, Councillor Wong Tam, I take your point very clearly. Just because the mayor said something during the campaign has proven time and time again that that doesn't mean that it's actually going to happen in the real world.
Thank you.
We can't be selective about which of his promises we deliver.
Thank you, Councillor Perks. Councillor Carroll.
Thank you. On clarification, I just want to understand the intent of adjusted proportionally. When you say proportionate, do you mean adding 2% onto each of the classes, or do you want the shift to be built into this 2% as well?
This builds the shift in.
So the 2% would be on one of those classes, and the others would be adjusted by the fractions that we've been using.
That's right, until we achieve the goal that we set out about the ratios between the industrial rate, the residential rate, and the commercial rate over the long term.
Okay, that's all I wanted. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Councillor Layton to speak.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I have three motions. I'll put the first one up. A, that City Council increase the proposed residential property tax rate by an additional 0.161%. That could allow for City Council to fund $4.2 million in programs such as the subsidies applied to the child care fees when it considers item EX 2.5 on the 2019 operating budget. Motion number two, that City Council increase the proposed property tax rate by an additional 0.022%. That could allow for City Council to fund $0.655 million in programs such as the ravine picking program when it considers item EX 2.5 on the 2019 operating and capital budgets. And C, that City Council increase the proposed residential property tax rate by an additional 0.842%. That could allow the City to fund $25.6 million in programs such as stopping the Toronto Transit Commission fare increase when it considers item EX 2.5 on the 2019 operating and capital budgets. First, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the Budget Chief, the committee members, as well as City staff for their work on the file. I know I've been on the Budget Committee for 7 years. It's not easy. I also know that I don't make it any easier. And I think that's my role. And I thank the Mayor for now another term putting some confidence in having an oppositional voice on the committee. I hope a respectful one most of the time. But trying to contribute in a way to give to provide a breadth of opinion about these matters. I'm going to take a bit of a different tack than my colleague, Councillor Perks. And I actually think that, like many of you, or many of you are like me, trying to fight for what you believe in, and trying to do so in a sound, financially, and compassionate way. I just think we have different beliefs, and that's fine. This democracy depends on us not all actually thinking the same way or doing exactly how we're told by those in authority. It's healthy. But I want you to consider a couple of things. One is how we distribute affordability. And I think Councillor Perks really touched on some of these points, that what we might be doing in assuming that there's affordability if we stick to an inflationary number for our property tax increase, while that might provide affordability or more affordability for some, it doesn't for others. And in this case, part of the budget is being balanced on a fare increase that adds to a decade of fare increases. And that's what I want to focus on a little bit, is that decade of fare increases. Over the past 10 years, we have seen a roughly $400 a year increase in our transit fares. $400 a year per person. Now imagine if you're a household struggling to pay the bills, you don't own a car, and you take public transit. How is that affordable for us to add another $50 on this year? How is that affordable? How does that make life more affordable? When in return for that, as my motion C suggests, it could be distributed more evenly across the city and cost every household less. If we value, and I'm going to speak to our user fee policy here, if we value the TTC and public transit as a public good and not an individual good, as I think most of you privately would agree, then why would we have 2/3 or 3/4 of it funded by the individual rather than by the city, rather than by the collective? If we think it's a public good, it should be funded publicly. That's what we would be able to do on the property taxes in this case. Distribute that affordability to everyone. Now, in that way, as Councillor Perks pointed out, you're actually helping those that affordability would impact the most. I'll be showing a graph later on that just demonstrates this. Just how much and how many low-income Torontonians depend on public transit. We all know it's a spectrum. People across the spectrum ride on public transit, but that 10-cent fare increase that translates to $50 more a year is essentially a 2% property tax increase on those individuals specifically. We've decided, rather than spread out that cost amongst the entire city, to target transit riders with a 2% property tax increase. That is what you're doing by passing that 10-cent fare increase. And I'm not saying that transit fares should never go up, but $400 over a decade is a lot of money. That's a lot to swallow when you're there being crammed in on the subways that are already full.
Thank you, Councillor
Or waiting
Lane.
for other. I didn't get to two of my.
Thank you. Councillor Pasternak to speak. Councillor Pasternak.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. High taxes hurt people. They hurt seniors. They hurt young families. They hurt people who have a dream of owning a home. I thank Councillor Matlow for handing out Toronto's senior strategy, and I hope all of you have read it. I will read a section for you. In recent years, the rapid increase in housing prices have been reflected on everyone's tax bills, putting a growing number of retired homeowners in a difficult financial position. The value of their principal asset is increasing far more quickly than their incomes, particularly if they are dependent on pensions or financial assets affected by the 2008 recession. High taxes hurt seniors, the people who fought in foreign wars, the people who raised families, who started businesses, who helped build this country and build this great city. The other warning sign is the leading number of foreclosures in the city. The Toronto Real Estate Board has estimated that the number of foreclosures, mortgage foreclosures in the city has increased by 24% from 2017 to 2018. Now, city staff may say, no, we're doing really well on collection of tax arrears. Well, that doesn't mean people aren't suffering. That doesn't mean people can't pay their bills. That doesn't mean people can afford high taxes. We have received many letters at our office of people who are in enormous distress. These are letters issued by the City of Toronto, a notice of issuance to bailiff. Can you imagine receiving this? Can you imagine more people suffering because they can't pay their tax bills? Sheriff's office, I didn't even know we had a sheriff's office until I started receiving these letters. And finally, I would say that the good people of Toronto do have an opportunity to pay higher taxes if they so wish. Traditionally, you heard during questions, there's a slip inside the tax bill that people can make a voluntary increased tax contribution to the City of Toronto. And that has gone out for many years. I understand now it is an electronic opportunity. This vehicle for collecting taxes has raised $25,000 to $30,000 a year on average. And I think one year it hit $40,000, according to Councillor Carroll. Well, the people of Toronto do not want higher taxes. They cannot afford higher taxes, and certainly when they're given the opportunity to pay higher taxes, they say no, and I think we should respect them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Matlow to speak.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, if you could put the motion on the screen. So I am moving what most likely is the lowest increment increase in Toronto's history. What that would equate to is about $1.80 per household for an entire year. That equates to, in some coffee shops, about the price, if not lower in some cases, than one single cup of coffee for an entire year to pay for youth spaces, the Tenants Defense Fund, and home share. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because one way or another, I, like most of you, deeply care about these initiatives. We're here because we want to change lives, and we want to improve our city, and we want to leave Toronto better than we found it. I also recognize, whether or not this passes, that I have a responsibility to work positively to find reasonable and responsible offsets to be able to achieve these goals too. I'm not a member of executive committee. I'm just doing my work on my own. I'm really doing my best to figure out one way or another to be able to fund initiatives that I have become convinced, based on the evidence in front of me, really help people. I'll give you an example. I was at Maria Shuka Library up at Dufferin, Eglinton recently, and I had a group of youth come up to me, and they were thanking us for caring about their lives. This supports both the poverty reduction and youth equity strategies. These are places where kids can go and be safe. These are places where single parents can know that their kids are safe after school. This is about rolling out a program where we have safe and caring youth spaces within 2 kilometers of every neighborhood, of every family in our city. That's something that we can do to change lives. I know the mayor believes in it. I believe in it. I know most of you believe in it. And I hope that one way or another today that you will find a way to support the initiative. With respect to tenants, 50% of us in Toronto are tenants. 50% of Torontonians are tenants. And one after another, they are faced with unfair and unaffordable above the guideline rent increases by their landlords. Landlords have the means to be able to have representation at the landlord and tenant board, and most of the time they get what they want. But tenants typically can't afford to. And that's why this would help fund the resources that they need to be able to even just have a knowledge base to even know how to navigate the system and be able to call the hotline and have somebody be able to answer and somebody be able to go into their building and help organize them when they don't even know where to start to be able to challenge the landlord that has the power and the means. And I know that you care about the tenants in your wards. Just like you care about, many of you have, there's a list of these proposed youth spaces, many of them would be in your wards. And I hope you look at that because you could be responsible for changing lives in a real way. And then last but not least, home share. And I've had a good conversation again with the mayor and many of you about the import of this and how innovative and intuitive it is. We have so many young people in this city who can't afford to live in Toronto and are looking for below market rent. And then we have many seniors who are financially poor but house rich and are looking for ways to make ends meet. Many of these seniors are isolated as well and are lonely, which affects their longevity and their quality of life and their health. You've got young people who are also looking for companionship and have the ability to do errands and do shopping and helping that senior. What if we have a program that we could incubate here, which doesn't have funding anymore from the seniors ministry, that maybe can be taken on by somebody else eventually? But this is a way for us to support seniors, young people who are struggling to afford Toronto, and a really, really cost-effective way, 90 grand, to create hundreds of affordable housing opportunities for people, which follows our commitment as a city to champion that. I ask you to consider this, but I also, in the next round, in the next item when we discuss the operating capital, that you consider whether it be this or offsets.
Thank you, Councillor Matlow. Thank you. Councillor Lai.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This is my first year on the budget, and I hope that I have many more to come. And I've heard all the history about how we can do a balanced budget and how we have to balance out on how we will distribute all these expenses. And I'd like to thank the city manager and the budget chief and all the people in the budget committee to do a good job in taking where we are here. And I know that there's poverty reduction and there's youth strategy. And today I've been brought up, with this very, very nice senior strategy here. And I know all the good things that the city has been doing. And with reduction of poverty, I've been there. I know how it is. But, it's never going to be enough that we can help the most vulnerable people. And in my ward, there's a lot of seniors that are very, very vulnerable, and they just cannot pay the property tax. And I echo with Councillor Pasternak about, how we have to care about, and I heard words about fairness and unfairness. You know, youth strategy, we've done quite a bit on youth strategy, and I'm happy to have this senior strategy. Hopefully we can invest more on our senior. I'll tell you what I do. I've been thinking it's really an impossible job for the mayor, for anybody on this council to make sure that all of the most vulnerable people are being taken care of. And what I've done is, actually, I have committed saying that, you know, we're going to talk to the province to see whether we can get more money. Yesterday, I was at the Economic and Development and Community Committee, and I've just found out that, you know, we're caring for long-term care, which is a province duty to do. So maybe we can talk about and work more and get more provincial funding. And as a councillor, I think we should probably, like what I just did on my community, in my community, I have encouraged more people to come to become auxiliary police officers so that we can relieve some of those police budget. It's not easy to balance, and I'm sure the mayor has heard all the comments here today. And going forward, I think we can consider maybe raising some of the property tax, but the mayor has made a campaign promise of just raising at the rate of inflation. I think at this hour, I think we should go for this, and we should maybe, in the years to come, maybe we can actually consider doing and increasing the property tax. So I'm just want to speak and support the mayor's motion of 2.55, the rate of inflation. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cressy to speak.
Well, thank you, Speaker. And like many of my colleagues, let me begin by thanking our city staff, certainly for shepherding this budget through, especially in an election year, but in particular, our budget chief, Councillor Crawford, and members of the Budget Committee for a long and diligent, and I would argue at all times, respectful process. And I want to commend Councillor Crawford in his 5th year for that. And certainly to our residents who have written emails, come out to budget town halls and the like. This is, like a number of you in the chamber, my 5th budget here at this city. And I will acknowledge, I think in my 2nd term and at the 5th budget, and I generally like to think of myself as a hopeful person, but the cynicism starts to set in a little bit. And I think, if I'm being completely honest, I think part of the cynicism is around, for all of us, the political theater that comes with the budget process. There is, as it comes, and as we go through this, a lot of chest pounding around the dangers and the benefits of a budget. And so I tire of that. I was thinking about it in terms of remarks and what to say in my 1st year of this new term, and I'm growing tired of that component. But of course, if we step back and think about a budget and take the theater out of it, a budget is at its core about people and the people who live here and how they get around, the services they need, the housing they have. And it's that old line, show me your budget and I'll tell you what your city's priorities are. And I think, and I'm hearing this a lot right now, that in this city, the cracks in our city are beginning to show. And not just as it relates to snow clearing, though that is certainly something I'm hearing every single day, that is the result of a low-tax city. And the cracks are showing. And for me, as I talk about always in this chamber, where it's showing most is on housing. That we are on rental housing, the least affordable city in the country. That we are on permanent housing, we have a waiting list of 181,000 people. Supportive housing, 15,000 people. Homeless, there are 9,000 people there. And we have become, according to United Way, the inequality capital of Canada. So as we debate the tax rate here, is it on the city alone to address all of those issues? Of course it's not. Absolutely not. The province and the feds have to be there. But are we, when we consider our own investment, doing our part? I don't believe we are. I think the word balance in a tough budget year is thrown around a lot, and that's part of the theater of this place. But we are making a virtue of so-called balance. And in this model, nobody wins. If you believe in a small government and cutting taxes, the so-called virtue of balance is letting you down. If you believe in a robust government, an investment in an active government, so-called balance as a virtue is letting you down. And so when it comes to our budget and our tax rate, I don't think we need balance. I think we need ambition. And I think it is time for us to step up and invest in the city once again. And if you don't believe that, move a cut. But the status quo isn't working anymore, and our residents are feeling it. And for that reason, I will be voting for the motions in front of us to increase taxes to ensure we have a more livable city for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cole, on the tax rate.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will not be voting for any tax increases above what the Mayor is recommending. And the reason I won't be doing that is because it basically adds to the notion that's been expressed here in this chamber, which I'm really upset about, is about that the people of Toronto don't pay enough taxes. And when you say that, you're basically giving in to that notion that exists throughout Ontario, throughout the GTA, that says, oh yeah, people in Toronto essentially have got it easy. And that is the direct opposite of the truth. You know, it's not just property taxes. If you look at what the people in Toronto pay in car insurance, if you look at what they pay in rent, if you look at what they pay to park their car compared to these other places, if you add all these things up, what they pay for childcare, what they pay to rent a basement apartment in Toronto, they could rent a whole house in Timmins, for instance. That's what you have to take into account, not just the property tax. And if you think magically by increasing property taxes, you're going to solve all the social ills, all the housing shortfalls we have, dealing with settling newcomers, you're dreaming in Technicolor. Because these are much bigger issues that we can control by adjusting property tax rates. And also, you know, what's depressing about it is we know full well that we're not going to get any help from the provincial government. And they're the last ones that'll say increase property taxes because they want it both ways. So we are in a real difficult situation. And then we've got a federal government, which has been traditional in the past, is that the federal government, along with the rest of Canada, never recognizes the fact that Toronto welcomes everybody. As immigrants, as newcomers, as refugee applicants, we welcome them. Then we find out we've got always shortfalls that fall on the back of our property taxpayers. We've got this year another $45 million that hasn't been paid because we welcome refugees that we should still be doing because they want to come to Toronto. So those are the bigger issues that a property tax increase isn't going to solve here. And what we're forgetting is that there are a lot of silent people living throughout Toronto who may be property tax or property rich but pocket poor. They may be living in a house that's worth $1 million, but they live paycheck to paycheck. They're the people that don't email, they don't come to meetings, but they cannot even afford, again, sometimes, to pay for food every week. They go to the food bank, they shop at No Frills, they buy in bulk. They don't even have waste that they dispose of because they shop daily. So these are the quiet people that are not going to be able to handle another cost increase because the other costs are always increasing in Toronto because of the fact is that Toronto, as someone said, is two realities. There's the reality of people that pay or have good paying jobs and live in great accommodation, etc. But then there's the half of Toronto that really cannot afford, whether it be a $60 fee for their car or another couple $100 on their taxes. They really cannot afford it. So by us saying, yeah, let's increase taxes, and we all agree, all these programs have been mentioned by the councillor who has spoken, we all support those programs, and we all have programs we would want enhanced. But to think we're going to really make an impact by keeping increasing property taxes, we are not. We have to find alternative ways of doing it, and I don't really have a magic bullet to do that, but by falling back on a property tax increase is a lazy way of doing it. Because then we're basically building up a tax system that basically has no appreciation of a person's real state of affairs financially. It's a regressive tax. It doesn't relate to your income at all. Because Toronto is a very different kind of place in Scarborough and North York as it is in downtown Toronto and Etobicoke. They're all different. And to sort of say, well, everybody can afford a tax increase is really short-sighted, and you're giving in to the people who like beating up on Toronto and saying how easy it is here.
Councillor Cole, thank you. Councillor Carroll to speak.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm gonna set that aside. I feel like delivering a rebuttal, but I won't. I wanted to rise to say that I feel like I have a mandate to support Councillor Layton's motions. I'm not sure if I agree with every single expenditure within Councillor Matlow's motion and Councillor Layton's motions, and we can get into that when we're dealing with item 5, whether or not that's exactly where we want to target those dollars. But when I take Councillor Matlow and Councillor Layton's motion, I come up to just a little over 1%. And that's exactly what I set out to find out from my residents. Here's the budget. Here are the things within it that trouble me. And in my view, if we were each of us, because we all pay the bill as well, we're most of us owners sitting around this table, if we were each willing to add a 1% on top of that cost of living increase that you already know you're going to do each year for 3 years, an extra $30 in each of those years, here's what happens to the overall envelope. And here's the kind of change you'll see and the gaps that might be filled. And in the main, Madam Speaker, in the main, the answer back, I will paraphrase when I say do it. I sent it out to 4,000 residents. And I didn't ask them for a 20% increase or a 30% increase. That's not what I asked them. So what about 1% a year for 3 years just to build the base and stop this haggling? And the answer back was do it. I got, out of the 4,000 people I sent it to, I know for sure, because we can do this technology, I know for sure that 1,800 people actually read it. And 2 people sent me an email saying no. Dozens sent me back letters saying do it, just do it. I'm tired of this. What is it you need? Just tell us. They want, we're not getting the money from the federal government, and yet we house 2 refugee hotels in our ward of Don Valley North, and they want them funded. And if there is no funding coming from anywhere else, something's got to be done in the meantime. So do it. They want to know that they don't have to worry that 10 years from now we'll be $3 billion in the hole with our roads. 5,000 kilometers of roads will all be in a disastrous state of repair. They don't want that. So they told me what they did want. Go ahead and do it. Those were the contents of the emails. They don't want me to keep haggling over how do you fit one more teenager into a community centre and make sure that the death toll of teenagers goes down a little. And so the answer was do it. Just do it. I don't want to haggle about children's lives anymore. Just do it. Because what I was asking them was reasonable. It was that tiny amount of increase. If your property tax bill is already $545 a month, because really people see that bill, it's that monthly bill they think about. And what we're talking about is instead of raising it to $555 a month, you're saying, could it be $565 a month and we can maybe feed some people, save some lives, fix some roads? The answer was do it. Please just do it. And so I can support these. I can't. I don't have a mandate to support Councillor Perks's motion. I apologize to my colleague, but I didn't ask him about 2%, because gradually increasing the base envelope was what I proposed. And that seemed very, very reasonable to the field that I polled. And so I can take the motions of Councillor Matlow and Councillor Layton and meet that local mandate that I received a month ago. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Councillor Wong Tam.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I do have two motions. The clerks can please put that on the screen. The first one is to raise the $160,000 to fund the Regent Park Aquatic Program pilot project in partnership with the TDS-based schools. Motion number two is to draw $70,000 to provide funding for the expansion of the rent bank and trusteeship program administered by the Neighborhood Information Post. That is the organization of the petition who I submitted this morning. Madam Speaker, there has been much talk about how do we build a city and how do we fund these expenditures that are required. And I would think that it's important, Madam Speaker, for us to also point out to many in the audience and those who are listening today who are using seniors as this political shield, a reason to never raise property taxes, as if we have no programs to provide support for seniors who own homes. That is not true, Madam Speaker. The City of Toronto has programs built in that provides cancellation of tax increases as well as deferral of tax increases for low-income seniors who own homes. It also does the same for low-income individuals who are living with disabilities. So that discussion about needing to choose between the food bank or perhaps any other expenditures is just simply not true. The City of Toronto already has these programs in place, and seniors who are low-income, who still are living in large homes after their children have left, who are on fixed incomes, they can apply for an entire tax cancellation program or tax increase deferral program. And we offer the same program for those who are struggling to pay their water bills. Madam Speaker, it's critically important, I think, for us to consider who gets left behind in a budget that doesn't address some of the structural capital deficits that are contained in this budget. $3.2 billion is the TCHC capital backlog right now. By not increasing the property taxes just by a modest amount, we are asking TCHC tenants to live in conditions that continue to deteriorate. No, you cannot have air conditioning. No, you cannot have repairs to your balcony. No, you cannot have your faucets repaired. No, we cannot remove that mold program and so forth. Madam Speaker, at some point in time, by deferring the state of good repair in the TCHC properties, they will start to fall and crumble. Just like the community in Fir Grove, who got a rude awakening when their properties were inspected and then condemned to demolition very quickly, that ended up being a much more dramatic intervention in their lives, and not to mention the fact that it costs us a lot more by deferring these constant capital repair costs. The TCC is $2.7 billion over the next 10 years behind. There are more and more people trying to get on the TTC, and we're making it harder and harder for them to use this particular service. I don't necessarily see drivers as well as cyclists and everyone else paying the vehicle registration tax. The only people we're asking in this budget to tighten their belts and pay a little bit more are, again, TTC riders, and I think that's just grossly unfair, especially when you take a look at who are these TTC riders. According to various different surveys, 57 to 64% of these riders happen to be women. They also happen to be low income and oftentimes living in the far reaches of the suburbs. That means that they get penalized more than anybody else because it's going to cost them more to get onto transit, not to mention the fact they're also providing primary care for the children and oftentimes for the seniors. There's been a lot of talk, Madam Speaker, about election promises and campaign pledges. Let's just explore that for 1 minute with my time that I have left. The mayor has made a commitment that he has to, and he's repeated it several times, that the tax rate in the City of Toronto must be kept to the rate of inflation or thereabouts. But his election promises did not stop there. He also made a campaign pledge to make sure that we would have 40,000 brand new recreation spaces across the city. The recreation wait list, Madam Speaker, is 60,000 persons deep. He also made a commitment to build 7,200 new supportive housing units, which I fully support. We desperately need these units in order to give people a pathway out of the shelters. There's also a commitment to build 5,000 brand new childcare subsidies. You heard it, Madam Speaker. The staff said they only have 210.
Thank you, Councillor Wong Tam. The last speaker is Councillor Crawford.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. First of all, I do want to thank the staff from the city manager all the way down for the work that they did. Yes, this has been an election year, and they take on a bigger, I guess, burden of pulling together. So I want to thank them, and of course my Budget Committee members who, you know, as Councillor Layton said, we do have our differences of opinions. And we express them differently at times, but I think there's an element of respect there that I try to do as the budget chair, and I think it's generally there. We have disagreements, and you know that's healthy. There's nothing wrong with having those disagreements. I've had the privilege to be budget chair for the last 5 years. Budget processes are challenging processes, no doubt. And there's ups and downs as we go through that process, but they are processes, and at the end of the day we make decisions, and hopefully they are good decisions. I think the decisions we've made over the last number of years have been good decisions, and we've moved forward. But what we have done every year, and this is the 5th budget I've been involved in, and leading, of course, with the mayor, keeping property taxes at the rate of inflation. We have done this for 5 years. We've been successful at keeping the property tax rates at inflation across the city. And I think that's a good thing from my perspective. It's affordable, it's reasonable, and it's balanced. What we sometimes, and we hear on the one side of what we're not doing, what more can we do? And you know what? Yes, there is more that we can do, and I think we as a council continually do that. When I look at the last 5 years, when we're looking at the poverty reduction, $160 million in there. And we're looking at the different strategies we have, the youth equity strategy, Transform TO. We are adding and we are building into this city. We are actually putting a lot into that, but at the same time, we are keeping property taxes at an affordable rate. And yes, we have heard, I mean, right now, when I'm looking at the numbers, there is, if we approve the property tax increases that are on the floor right now, and including when we get into operating, almost 7%. And, you know, to me, that's not an acceptable number to be able to go to the people that I represent out in my ward and across the city to say we want to increase your property tax increases by more. And when you look at, I'm not going to get into all the details of all of the motions that Councillor Layton moved, Councillor Cressy, Councillor Matlow, a lot of those initiatives, and I'm not going to comment on those initiatives, they're great initiatives, absolutely great initiatives, but where they belong is next year's process. Putting them into the process and you know what, we can achieve these as we have done, but to come onto the floor in such a manner to put them here, I don't think is responsible. People would disagree with me on that, but again, when I'm looking at those, when I'm saying I'm not supporting the tax increase to potentially do those, it doesn't mean I don't want to do those. Of course I want to do those. And when we look at, you know, again, I want to just go back to what we have done over the last 5 years, the accomplishments that we have done, because I think sometimes during a budget process, we don't look at that. We don't really pay attention to what we've done. So just, and we've been talking about them. When you're looking at the historic increases to the TTC, we've increased by 31% our funding. Our capital contributions have increased. We have Transform TO. We look at childcare, poverty reduction. Yes, we can debate that it's not enough, but we have continually added year after year, and we've been doing that, keeping property taxes low. So I will not be supporting. I will be supporting, of course, the mayor, the 2.55% plus the 0.5 as we get there. I will not be supporting any of the other increases because I don't think that's a responsible thing for us to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. If you just give me a minute. Councillor Pasternak?
I'd like to go on the record. I'm going to recuse myself from voting on motion 3, Councillor Matlow's motion, because it includes additional funding for Toronto Public Library. So I'll be stepping out for that vote.
Yes, but he declared an interest at the beginning, and because it's included in this, he's declaring it. Yeah. Yeah, so if you can declare the interest, Councillor Pasternak, again, because originally you declared it on number 5.
No, I'd be happy to declare an interest on members' motion 3 related to the tax increase.
On item 2.1.
On item 2.1.
Okay. Okay, if you can fill out the form, please.
Crazy.
Okay, members of council, I just want to comment before we take the vote. So before we vote on these motions, I want to remind members of council that this item concerns deciding the tax rates to be levied. Several of the motions mention examples of things that could be funded by the proposed increases to taxes. While these lists are interesting, they are not the matters before us on this item. Should any of the motions containing lists of suggested programs pass, that does not mean those programs are funded. I'm going to treat these motions as a series of motions to increase the tax rate. We will vote on them from largest to smallest. If any of them should carry, the others will be redundant. We're only voting on the tax rate only. Okay? In numerical order? Oh, okay. Okay. Motion 1, put it on the screen. Recorded vote. Okay, recorded vote.
Motion 1 does not carry. The vote is 5 to 20.
Motion 2C.
Hang on one second. We got to.
Okay, recorded vote.
Motion 2C does not carry. The vote is 7 to 18.
Motion 2A. Recorded vote.
Councillor Pasternak, please.
Motion 2A does not carry. The vote is 8 to 17.
Motion 3, Councillor Matlow, I believe this is the one that you have an interest in. Motion 3, recorded vote.
Councillor Perks, Councillor Wong Tam.
Motion 3 does not carry. The vote is 8 to 16.
Motion 2B, recorded vote.
Councillor Perruzza, please.
Motion 2B does not carry. The vote is 8 to 17.
Motion 4A, recorded vote.
Councillor Karygiannis, please. Councillor Carroll, please. Councillor Perruzza. Thank you.
Motion 4A does not carry. The vote is 7 to 18.
Motion 4B, recorded vote.
Councillor Perks, please. Councillor Perks. Thank you.
Motion 4B does not carry. The vote is 8 to 17.
Okay, so on the item from executive, recorded vote.
Councillor Perruzza, please.
The item is adopted. The vote is 21 to 4.
Okay, thank you. Okay, our next item is 2.5. Point of order, Councillor Perks.
Thank you, Speaker. I'm uncertain about how to proceed here. I have some questions about the dollar value of the settlement with the Toronto Police Union and the non-program amount that was allocated there. And I'm not certain if, I've asked the clerk to consider it and the city manager to consider it. I'm not certain if these are public questions or what they are. I was wondering if we could get some advice on that.
We don't have an answer at the moment.
Well, we're on the item and I have to know what questions I'm allowed to ask.
Okay,
It's kind of my right.
okay, but does anybody else have any questions? on 2.5. We're
No,
going
that's
to...
the main operating and capital budget.
Yes, 2.5. Okay,
Well-
let's start that. Yes, Councillor Perks.
I'm sorry, I let the clerk's office know I had this concern yesterday. I raised it this morning prior to the beginning of the meeting with the city manager. I do need to understand this.
Yes, I understand that, and I'm waiting for the staff to comment. And until I get an answer, I wanted to start the item with other members of council.
I'm sorry, I have to remind you that in the procedures bylaw, among the responsibilities of the Toronto City Clerk is to advise City Council on the correct application of the rules when we're debating an item. And I need to know this before we get on to this item.
Yeah, maybe we should have lunch. No, because this morning we decided 2.1 and 2.5 was the mayor's key item. No, I understand. I understand, Councillor Perks.
So if I can, through the speaker, my understanding is that it has not been ratified, and if we were to discuss it, we'd have to go and close.
Okay, we'll move to close. You read the motion, and then we're going to break for lunch. Well, okay, but there's no point in going in camera for it's 12:15. So why don't we have lunch and then move that motion to go in camera when we come back? It's by the time we get into in camera, that's going to take 10 minutes. Okay, so let's break for lunch.